Joining me now, criminal defense attorneys Kelly Hyman and Andrew Cherkasky. Thank you both. Let's start with this 118. This is a social worker who really had answers for every question and seems to be kind of just a down-the-middle type of individual, very empathetic, and kind of sees the plight of the victim, I guess you will, or the underdog, if you will, which might work well for the defense because in the courtroom here, Kelly, isn't Chauvin the underdog? I mean, this could be an individual that she wants to know about training, and she's always looking into why people do things.
Right. No, I think that's really important. You want someone on the jury that's going to be fair and impartial and not make a determination until they hear all the evidence, because that's ultimately what you want. And then based on the evidence and following the law, make a determination on whether someone is innocent or guilty.
Andrew, your take on the fact that the juror 118 made it through. Would you have used a strike against her if you were on either one of the sides?
No, I talk a lot about the difference between somebody who really has a justifiable reason why you need to get them off the panel versus those who you kind of have a gut instinct. After doing dozens or hundreds of trials and seating many, many juries, you tend to get a way about you. You don't want certain types of jurors. You don't want enigmas. You don't want people who you feel confused by. And so this is one who seems pretty open about it all. And so there's not something that would obviously sit wrong in my stomach. That's, though, ultimately for the lawyers in the courtroom. We didn't see anything that would have her kicked, and so we saw that the attorneys didn't have something sitting in their gut that wasn't quite right either.
Yeah, let's take a listen to one of the answers that she had. She was sort of negative or neutral when it came to George Floyd.
Why did you have a somewhat negative impression of the officer to a neutral, and why would it be important to get more information?
The somewhat negative is just the constant showing of it, I think, for a while there when it first occurred, and just the reaction from the community as well. Just the constantness of that, I think, made me believe it was the somewhat negative, and the reasoning for my answer on that. But the neutral side of it was I'm always thinking about the person and, again, where they came from, what they've been through, experienced. And my neutral side of that was that his training to do that based on what occurred, and I didn't see the whole thing to be able to know whether that is what occurred.
Okay, so ultimately the question of police training or police practice may be a part of this trial. You're not a police officer, right?
Correct.
And I know you said you've had some training as a social worker to kind of deal with potential threats. Would you be able to kind of set aside what you may have learned and pay attention to the police practices as presented in court?
Yes.
Kelly, she brought up training, and it seems to me that the two major tracks here that is going to be a point of contention at trial. You're going to have cause of death and then also training, because the defense has this image from the Minneapolis police training booklet that shows a very similar image to that neck hold. It's been, since George Floyd's death, has been outlawed, but those two things are very important. And for the juror to have such a acute sense of wanting to know more about training, what's your take on that fact, and do you agree that training is going to be a big part of this trial?
Well, Ted, I think you bring up a really good point. Absolutely. I think that training is going to be really important in this case. I think that that's something where the defendant is going to try and say that, look, this officer followed the protocol, followed the procedures, followed the training. This is what he was supposed to do. This is what he did. Having said that, though, it's important to think about, the ultimate outcome of what happened. And ultimately, it'll be up to the jury based on the evidence that they hear, make a determination on whether the defendant is guilty or innocent. But yes, I think training is going to play a key role. And the fact that the juror's open mind to it, that's going to listen to the evidence, I think is key.
And Andrew, experts are going to be on both of these, an expert saying, yeah, well, it's in the training manual, but you're not supposed to do it after the person's been passed out or, for 9 minutes. Your opinion on that, the fact that experts are going to be huge in this trial?
Well, I think that this is one of those jurors who's really critical for the defense with that idea that there's going to be a reliance on what the experts say the training was. Because I think there are ultimately two different types of jurors here. There's the ones who will very much look at what the training looked like and whether Chauvin was consistent with that, versus those who want to take an individual's responsibility and kind of separate it from what the training said and add an element of humanity to it. That, you know, at a certain point, you have to overcome your own training and make sure that you're doing something that makes sense and that's just under those circumstances. So I think this is a juror who's very much going to be focused on literally what the training was, as opposed to kind of more of that humanitarian, wouldn't somebody have led up by that point type of question.
Yeah, and that could come back to each juror's relationship with training. This is a social worker who does annual training about her job. Other jurors will come in with a different sense of training and think, oh, forget your training. You just should be who you are and save somebody if they need saving. And there is that photo of from the police training booklet, which depicts a similar move, if you want, a restraint on an individual using the knee on an individual's neck to restrain, and this was part of the training regiment for the Minneapolis Police Department, which Derek Chauvin, of course, was exposed to. All right, we're going to step aside and take a break. We'll have much more ahead. You're watching Court TV, your front row seat to justice. Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Ted Rollins. Glad to have you along with us. On this Monday, Judge Peter Cahill made a number of critical rulings on Friday that could have major implications for both sides when it comes to trial strategy. He ruled that the trial will not be delayed. The defense wanted to delay it, and it will also not be held outside of Minneapolis. They wanted to change the venue. He said no. He also said a video from a previous George Floyd arrest can be admitted, but only a very select portion of the video, specifically the part that goes to cause of death. He also excluded the testimony of a state witness, psychiatrist Dr. Sarah Vinson, who was going to be an expert witness for the state of Minnesota. Judge said, no, you can't bring her in. The ruling on Floyd's 2019 arrest, that is a big deal for the defense. Even though Judge Cahill did say only a small portion of it can come in, they fought for months to get this in, and now they do have some of it in. We isolated the part that we believe Judge Cahill is referring to when he says this portion only can come in. Here's what he is allowing.
Okay, relax. Just undo your seatbelt. Let her take care of her guy. Just keep your hands out where I can see him. Hey! Let me... Keep your hands where I can see him. Okay? Put them up on the dash. Put them on the dash. I'm not going to shoot you. Put your hands on the dash. Put your hands on the dash. The last time I'm going to tell you that. It's simple. He keeps moving his hands around. He won't listen to what I have to say.
Put your hands on
Okay.
top of your head.
On your head.
Top of your head.
Okay, man.
Open your mouth. Spit out what you got. Spit out what you got. I'm gonna tase you. Spit it out. He's eating all
Don't you
kinds
jerk
of
away
stuff.
from me.
That was one yellow pill. Put your hands behind your back.
That was one yellow pill, boss. Okay, now slowly come on out.
Hand under
Now put your
Hand under your head. Hands underneath your back.
Okay, relax then. You're not going to get beat up or nothing if you just follow what we're asking you to do.
Now, the defense wanted that in. They argued that it's basically an MO, a modus operandi, and that Floyd had a tendency to ingest contraband and avoid arrest. The defense also specifically said that Floyd's emotional response to officers in 2019 were very similar. And if you've seen the body cam from the 2020 incident, it's very, very similar between the two. Judge Cahill touched on that part during his ruling. Take a listen.
Well, there are certain things that are not relevant. Mr. Floyd's emotional behavior is not relevant to cause of death once he is pulled out of the squad car. His statements, while they are very similar to what was said on May 25th, don't really establish anything other than perhaps his mental state. And as I think the state correctly notes in its memo from yesterday on page 3, Mr. Floyd's internal motivations on May 25th are immaterial. Whether he was genuinely anxious, claustrophobic, or suffering a panic attack, or whether he was malingering, is of no consequence. He was exhibiting certain behaviors which are evident on both videotapes, both May 6th, 2019 and May 25th, 2020. But they were the behaviors, regardless of their source, regardless of their motivation, whether they were due to anxiety or due to malingering, doesn't matter, because it is the behavior that the officers in both cases were required to deal with. The behavior is remarkably similar in reviewing the tapes. However, that does not make the emotional behavior of Mr. Floyd admissible.
Still with us, criminal defense attorneys Kelly Hyman and Andrew Cherkasky. Kelly, this is a huge win, is it not, for the defense just to get any of this encounter in, because let's face it, it's jarring.
No, absolutely, Ted. You bring up a really good point, and I have tremendous respect for the judge in this case. However, I disagree. I don't believe that this evidence should be brought forth or put on. I think that its prejudicial value is worse than its probative value. In other words, that it's going to be prejudicial to George Floyd, and I definitely think it should be excluded.
Andrew, your thoughts on the ruling?
You know, the judge really drew a line between behavior and emotions of George Floyd, but I don't know that the videotape itself is going to be able to remove that from the minds of the jury. In fact, I think it's the emotional side of it, the potential that he was malingering in the 2019 video, that would potentially lead a juror to think that the outcries in the 2020 video were malingering type outcries, or that it wasn't as genuine as we all feel it is as we watch the video itself. So I think that the judge was trying to draw a line. I'm not sure that it's going to be successful in the jury's mind. Definitely a big win for the defense here, and certainly goes a long way to put in front of the jury kind of the total amount of the evidence, to include some of that past stuff. We don't see that in a lot of cases.
Yeah, a remedy, Kelly, would have been to bring those officers in to talk about the fact, because what Judge Cahill is saying, well, the jury should see anything that maybe goes to cause the death, in that he ingested drugs, he admitted it to a paramedic, and that he was resisting arrest, and he had a gun pointed at him. And that was a big part. Judge Cahill thought, well, a gun in your face is going to elevate your heart rate, it's going to change your mood. But wouldn't the same thing be accomplished technically without the emotion if you just bring those police officers in and say, well, what did you encounter?
Right. You know, I think, Ted, you bring up a really good point. That's another option as well. But the judge made a determination and felt that the best way to show it was by the video.
Yeah. Let's talk about this expert, Andrew, that was told she could not testify, or the state was told not to bring her on. And this was going to be somebody that was going to offer the jury another explanation for George Floyd's behavior, that he was not resisting arrest. He's a claustrophobic man who was having a major panic attack. Your take on the judge saying, no, I'm sorry, that goes to state of mind, and no one knows his state of mind.
Right. The Supreme Court has been pretty consistent on this, and you see this a lot throughout trial courts. Anytime you have a witness that's going to tell you, even if it's an expert witness, what the state of the mind is of anybody, whether that's the accused person, whether that's a victim, or whether it's somebody else related to the case, you're likely not going to get that information in. What those forensic psychologists and those psychiatrists are there to do is to educate the jury to understand more about how people think, why they think a certain way, motivations that underlie it, and how mental health conditions can affect people's ability to remember, perceive, etc., as opposed to telling a jury what somebody was thinking at a time based on even their expert analysis of what that might have been. It's just not sufficiently reliable. It's called a human lie detector, and it's just not something that we rely on regularly.
Yeah, and the judge did say, well, if the defense goes too far, you could bring her on in a rebuttal case. but that could open up even more cans of worms with the entire 2019 incident being brought in during that. All right, thank you both. We will talk to you again in just a bit. We're going to step aside, though, and take a break right now because coming up, it's the Daily Sidebar. We'll talk about our new juror, 118, on the panel. Just one more to go. Stay with us. You're watching Court TV, your front row seat to justice. Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Ted Rollins. It's time for the Daily Sidebar. Opening statements in this case begin 7 days from today. And at this moment, we have 14 jurors seated. One additional juror has been selected today, a white woman in her 20s. She's a social worker who says she thinks police reform is necessary when it comes to mental health.
You were asked a question whether you or someone close to you has ever supported or advocated in favor of or against police reform, and you wrote, family members have discussed support of both. What do you mean by that, and how does that, what was the general tenor of the conversations on both sides?
It was typically focused on training in response to situations of like mental health or things like that, having more specific mental health and not so focused on the what seems like a presumption of guilt right away, that sort of thing.
3 other jurors were dismissed today for a variety of other reasons. Let's bring in our colleagues. Julia Janae is in Minneapolis covering the trial. Julie Grant and Michael Ayala also here. The defense used a strike to eliminate juror 115 right out of the gate this morning. She appeared to be maybe a little too excited about the prospects of being on this jury, and wasn't the first person to come with that mentality. I mean, every answer she had kind of was like, oh, I did say that on my questionnaire, but I could be fair. Please let me on. Bottom line is they said no. Let's take a listen.
You personally participated in a couple of marches, and you carried a sign that had a fist on it, I think.
Yes.
Why did you do that?
My friend invited me to go. We were living in Minneapolis at the time, and it was close by. And she's like, "You want to go?" And it's something I'd never done before, so I was like, "Yeah, we should do it." And
So what was it about the march that you thought it would be, I don't know, entertaining or interesting or just an experience? Like, why did you think that?
well, because like I said, I'd never done something like that before, and I've seen that stuff, in movies or whatever. So it looked interesting, and of course I'd seen the video and things. So I was like, yeah, let's go check it out, and so that's what I did.
And why did you decide to carry the sign you did?
Because my friend and I we were making the signs before. She said, we should carry these. And I was like, yeah. So we did those.
So you made some other signs as well?
I didn't make other ones, but it was like she made one, I made one, and then I think like her boyfriend made one too or something like that. So.
Okay. Was your participation sort of contemporaneous to the time, or was it like when the incident occurred, or was it weeks later?
I want to say it was about a week later, I think.
All right, Julia Janae, let's start with you. This was no big surprise, but this was the only one who got bounced this morning.
Right, not a surprise that the defense was going to use a strike on juror number 115. She was a nursing assistant. The pool reporter estimated that her age was in the 20s or 30s. She sounded really cheerful when she was answering her questions. But of course, the defense digging into her attending a protest. A lot of the jurors that we have already on this jury panel have not attended any kind of march or protest, which I think is significant looking at how many people were involved in protests, especially here in Minneapolis. She also said that she had a favorable view of Black Lives Matter as a movement, but did not have a favorable view of Blue Lives Matter, mentioning that the police officer can take off their uniform. It's not like their skin. Ultimately, she said it was not George Floyd's time to die in her questionnaire. And I think even that personal note in the way that she said that was one of the other reasons that she was struck for cause by the defense.
Tried her best. Julie Grant, 116 then was up, and the defense obviously wanted her. The state tried to get him for cause bringing up his fishing, saying, you're going to miss a bass tournament. You sure you can't do this, can you? And his employer wasn't going to be paying him, but at the bottom line, they needed to use one of their strikes. He was an interesting guy because he didn't know anything about anything. And he admitted, he said, I don't watch the news. I stay out of that. I keep my nose out of those types of things. He was kind of a blank slate, but he did have some things that you could see why the state wanted him gone.
Sure, Ted. Yeah, God bless him. He seems to be living a really simple life and seems to be really disinterested in the news and current events. And that's problematic for these attorneys because they're trying to get a read on him, right? Voir dire is all about trying to get a read on these prospective jurors. What does your gut feeling tell you? What are they saying? What's their body language look like? And when he said he doesn't post opinions, I thought about how these attorneys, we're seeing them day in and day out, right? But surely they have assistants who are digging deep on social media and trying to find out how these folks live their lives, what they're all about, what opinions or preconceived notions they might have. And so they probably tried without success to figure this guy out. And the questioning wasn't helping when he's going, no. And I mean, it was kind of stunning his unawareness with the Capitol riots on January 6th and what little he knew about that. It was concerning. So I don't blame the state for striking him. They couldn't get a read on him. It was smart to let him go, Ted.
Yeah, let's listen to, because I agree. When they started to go to that, I'm like, oh, here we go. He's going to know all about that riot, right? Oh, no, he didn't know much about that either. Take a listen.
Are you aware of the events that happened in Washington, D.C. in January?
Yes.
And how did you learn of those events?
That was all, I mean, I was at work and that's a big thing at work, people talking about it. So, and then again, you see clips of it. Not something I really followed there.
Can you describe to me what you saw when you saw it?
Well, that massive amounts of people around the Capitol, in the Capitol, and then obviously milling around where they shouldn't be. I guess there was a couple of injuries and possibly deaths.
All right, Michael, anything stand out to you from what we saw this morning in terms of the jurors who either side used a strike for that you think maybe shouldn't have, or juror 118, who's now part of the panel?
Yeah, 118, I can talk about her. She's someone who's going to be on this jury. And as she was being voir dired, I thought she was a good juror, a good potential juror. She seemed to be neutral. She seemed to have an interesting point of view in terms of both George Floyd and the defendant in this case. She's somewhat neutral, is kind of where she stood. The two things that jumped out to me was, and I think you mentioned this on your show, the training aspect. I think as someone who has received training for certain types of situations, she might have a better understanding of how difficult it is sometimes under duress, how to implement perfect training. And I think there certainly were mistakes made. So they're going to want someone, the defense anyway, who understands that, you do the best you can with the training you have, and sometimes mistakes are made. But the second thing that jumped out at me was she talked about being afraid about the riots might end up in the suburbs, right? And I'm thinking when she's in that jury room, that's something that's got to be on her mind, because she knows that a verdict in this case, perhaps the wrong verdict, whatever that might end up being, could lead to riots, and her safety is going to be concerned, the safety of the suburbs. So that has to be something that's going to sit in her mind. And what role will those thoughts play in her decision-making process? Is she more susceptible to some sort of compromise verdict as a result? So those are the things that came to my mind.
Interesting. Yeah, you could argue that all of the jurors are open to a potential compromise verdict because of what they all witnessed collectively. This is one unique thing about this jury pool. They all had a collective experience, and that is the days and weeks following George Floyd's death. That city was rocked. I mean, it is to this day a different city than it was at the time. Let's take a look at the jury makeup as we have, as it stands now. We have two multiracial, 8 white and 4 black jurors so far. The number of strikes remaining for each side are, they're down to their last couple, the state, down to 2, but there's only 1 left. And, and Julia, it's our understanding that this last juror to be picked is going to be the juror who's on call for the next 4 days, right? This juror's likelihood, the next one to be picked, of actually serving on the jury is pretty low.
Yeah, this is a backup juror. This is just in case one of the jurors on the panel has to back out or something happens, a sickness, just an absence. The judge wanted to make sure that there's no issue on March 29th, that we can go forward and we will have 14 jurors. So we have 14, but there's still 1 more that the judge wants to have on the roster.
I know it's because of COVID that they're a limited amount, Julie, but I'm a little nervous that this is a 4-week trial, and the fact there's only 2 alternates. We've covered many trials on Court TV where alternates come into play, and sometimes it's boom, boom, one after another, let alone during deliberations.
Exactly. You make a great point, Ted. And I think that was why, after thinking about it, the judge thought we better seat someone else just as a precaution, because this is going to be an extensive trial. From what we understand it, the projection is 4 to 5 weeks after the opening statements begin on Monday. And so who knows what can happen? That's a lot of time. Things occur. Jurors drop out for whatever reason. So I think it is very wise that the judge wants to seat another alternate juror just in case something occurs. And I understand that COVID has made things difficult, and perhaps there would be more alternates from the outset were we not in this situation. But I think it is smart to work around that just in case we lose one.
Yeah, Michael, I mean, let's face it, if there was no COVID here, we'd have 4 or 5 alternates minimum, I would think, with a 5-week, 4-week trial.
Oh, no question about it. Again, this is just another example of how COVID comes into play. I mean, this is a high-profile trial. I mean, just recently we had a trial where folks were watching it at home, and then they would come in and talk about it and got kicked out of the trial. I mean, that's something that could absolutely happen here. We've seen a couple of very enthusiastic jurors, so who knows what they might be involved in. So, I'm with you, Ted. It's a little worrying, the fact that there are only 2 alternates, but this is the world we're living in, and they're going to have to make it work.
Yeah, and I guarantee you there's going to be some issue with potential juror misconduct coming up during the trial, but we will wait and see, and hopefully that will not happen. All right, that's it for the Daily Sidebar. Thank you all. We're going to step aside, take a break, and have much more when we return. Stick around. Court is in recess until 1:30 Central Time, 2:30 Eastern. Once they're back, we'll get you back in for the end of jury selection. Stay with us. Welcome back. The media frenzy surrounding Derek Chauvin's case is reminiscent of another high-profile murder trial we covered right here on Court TV, California versus O.J. Simpson. Well, this weekend, O.J. weighed in, urging his Twitter followers to, quote, let the legal system work. Listen to O.J. Simpson react to Judge Cahill's decision not to change the venue in this case.
I see what a judge in Minnesota decided not to change a venue for the Chauvin case. That's on the George Floyd situation, and I thought that was a good decision. I never once asked to have a venue change, even though I saw an episode of Law and Order once that implied that I did, but no, I never did. I don't think it works. In this day and age, you got cable TV, everybody knows everything about everything. You know what I'm saying? So I see in Minnesota, they got a jury, it appears right now, that reflects, the makeup of the neighborhood. And I think that's a real good thing.
All right, O.J. Simpson watching along. And O.J.'s defense team did not request a change of venue as a matter of strategy back then. They wanted to get this trial in front of a jury as quickly as possible to put the state on its heels. Well, Court TV's crews hit the streets of downtown Minneapolis on Friday, speaking to protesters advocating for equality in the justice system. But there's a very different conversation happening inside the courtroom, where attorneys are questioning potential jurors to get a feel for their opinions on protests and the riots that had happened after George Floyd's death, and how those feelings could impact their jury service.
You were asked a question about your belief as to whether or not the community has been negatively or positively affected by any of the protests that have taken place in the Twin Cities area since George Floyd's death.
use your words or whatever resources that you have in order to seek justice, in order to make change happen, and in order to really demand that we take accountability for our actions.
And you wrote both. The raising of voices is being heard around the world for change, and that's good.
We're here to demand justice for George Floyd.
After Mr. Floyd died, there were lots of protests, and then there were riots. Do you think that those negatively or positively impacted the Twin Cities community as a whole?
I'm not sure.
We are standing together for human life, and you are never wrong for standing up for human life.
The world seeing what happened, and we demand change.
The positive things that I see that came out of it were, really giving people a voice that maybe didn't feel heard.
I once was lost, but now I'm found. We must love and support one another. We must love and support one another.
I feel like everybody has a right to protest. I feel it's a way to get the word out, attention to issues that people are concerned about.
If someone was to make the statement that Black Lives Matter or some other lives matter, that they're saying other lives don't matter?
It can be perceived like that. Okay. Maybe they felt that they were never heard, and that's why they are coming up with Black Lives Matter, because maybe they felt that they never were seen, they never were heard, and whereas I don't believe that to be true.
And do you think that the people who protested are also responsible for the rioting?
The mass majority, no.
But some may have been involved in both.
Correct.
I think some things led to the rioting, and I think that some people brought awareness through their protesting.
And we hope that we get the justice that the family deserve and that the people deserve. Regardless, we're going to continue to stay out here. We're going to show up and show out.
All right, still with us, Kelly Hyman and Andrew Cherkasky. This is a huge trial in terms of publicity, and every day these jurors are going to see and hear what's going on outside of the courthouse. How does it affect what their decision process, or how could it affect? We don't know how it will, but how could it potentially affect this jury as they try to do their work, Kelly?
Well, I think it can have an effect on them, on their perception of what they think. I mean, it all boils down to what's people's perception, whether they believe that Black Lives Matter or whether they believe that all lives matter, whether they believe in peaceful protesting or believe that perception of more is a rioting. And I think that that's key in people's perception. But hopefully I'm optimistic that the jurors will listen to the evidence and based on the evidence, make a determination on whether he is guilty or innocent.
Andrew, there's no secret here. The people that are going to be outside the courthouse want the people inside the courthouse to deliver a guilty verdict. Does that play in?
You know, I think that going into this, there's a general sense that the jurors have kind of an overall idea of what the population is thinking. They all have seen the video. They all saw news articles, and all of those news articles were very heavy in the idea that this was a murder, that there was a wrong that was done here. So I think that they're going in with that. I think the big thing to look out for is if there is some sort of sway from a substantial portion of the population that starts to see something in favor of Mr. Chauvin, starts to see something in the middle, and that gets back to the jury, that could have an impact that it starts to sway them to think that the population, the common population, is starting to change their opinion from what they saw going into the trial. And that's something that I think could be a very big swing. I don't think that's likely, but that's what I think the biggest risk is.
Kelly, are you concerned about jury misconduct in a case this large?
Well, the judge has done an amazing job, and I'm hopeful that it won't happen. But it's always a concern of whether they post something on social media or whether they do something on the internet or whether they see something on the news. Absolutely, that's always a concern. But the way the judge has handled this, I'm hopeful and optimistic that there won't be any type of issue.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like either side wants to derail the process at this point. We haven't seen that in terms of continued motions to just get into the to muck up the proceedings. So I would be shocked too if either side comes to the judge and says, "Oh, you got to kick this person off," unless it's substantial. Andrew Cherkasky, Kelly Hyman, thank you as always for your expertise. We're going to step aside, take a break as we approach the top of the hour, and as we go to break, let's take a look outside in downtown Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Hennepin County Government Center. They'll be back in court at 1:30 Central Time. 2:30 Eastern, and as soon as the judge is back on the bench, we'll get you back in live. Stay with us. You're watching Court TV, your front row seat to justice.
We are 1 week away from opening statements in the Derek Chauvin murder trial. And we're also one juror closer to seating the full panel, with only one more juror to go. You are watching Court TV Live, your front row seat to justice. A very good Monday afternoon to you, and thank you so much for being with us here on Court TV Live. I'm your midday host, Julie Grant. So we are in the lunch recess in the Derek Chauvin murder trial. Court scheduled to resume in just about 30 minutes from now. As soon as Judge Peter Cahill takes the bench, we will take you back inside the courtroom live. Now, with 7 days to go until the opening statements begin, we are nearing the end of jury selection, but we're not quite there yet. So let's take a look at the numbers. So far, 14 jurors have been seated. So this would be 12 to make up the jury plus 2 alternates. But on Friday, we learned Judge Peter Cahill wants to have one more juror seated as an alternate just to be insurance with this case. So this morning, both sides agreed on juror number 118 to make up the panel of 14 just before the lunch break. Juror number 118 is a white female. And I believe we have a little listen to some of what she said during the jury selection process. Let's listen to that now.
Now, with respect to Mr. Floyd, you checked somewhat negative, neutral, and somewhat positive. And you wrote, reporting showed both good and bad. His family that he was a nice person, but also showed a history of drugs, unknown which one. I did not done my own further research. Okay. Let me ask you, in terms of your impression of Mr. Floyd, can you explain kind of, there's a wide spectrum, you kind of hit the whole spectrum there. Can you explain that a little?
I think that's part of where I come from, is always looking at every side of things. I'm always looking at why someone may have done something a certain way. His experience before with law enforcement, I thought about his family, because I saw the family so much on the news. So again, I had all kinds of thoughts on him with his past. They've talked about his past with drugs and things like that. I had every emotion, I think, about him.
So perhaps this is a very overbroad generalization, but social workers tend to be empathetic people. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So I guess the question being is that, what if you don't hear anything about Mr. Floyd's past? I mean, what if you don't, in this trial, knowing what you had heard before, again, can you set that aside and listen to the evidence as it's presented in court?
Yes.
In your professional life, do you work with people who abuse or have abused controlled substances?
Yes, sometimes, not regularly. It just depends.
Okay. Do you think that if someone uses or abuses controlled substances, that makes them a bad person?
No.
Why do you think people may have that struggle?
I think it's a lot of things. It just depends on the person. I never judge a person based on that alone.
You were asked some questions about whether you had ever spoken with friends, family members, coworkers, or had any discussions online about this. You checked the box yes, and you wrote with family. So is it fair to assume you did not post any opinions on social media about this case?
I don't think, no, I've never, no.
Okay. But with your family, you wondered what caused or prompted the knee on the neck based on the training received by Derek Chauvin and all officers. And then on Twitter, you wrote that you were scared for the state of Minnesota as we were told violence was moving to the suburbs on the news.
Yes.
So you were obviously aware of the unrest that occurred after Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes.
And that caused you some fear?
Yes.
Okay. And you had heard some stories that it was expanding beyond the Twin Cities proper?
Yes.
Okay. Again, in terms of the training, you would understand that, again, that is a bit of a contest or perhaps conflict in this case. Do you understand?
Yes.
And would you be able to set, any of those discussions that you've had with family members or friends about what they think police training says about this incident aside, listen to the evidence from both sides and make your decision based on that?
Yes.
You were asked the question whether you believe that the community was negatively or positively affected by any of the protests that have taken place since Mr. Floyd's death, and you wrote both. Negative in the sense that people took advantage of rioting and looting, even from out of state, that affected others' livelihood, but positive in that the community has seemingly come together to make it better. So do you differentiate between protesting and rioting or looting?
Yes.
How do you define the two?
Protesting, making your voice heard about something that you don't agree with, hoping for positive change, and rioting, looting is taking advantage in the sense of using those discussions of wanting positive change into something negative.
Okay. You were asked ultimately if you feel that you could be fair and impartial, regardless of your opinions, and you wrote, I believe I could. So ultimately, unfortunately, I have to press you a little bit. We can't have equivocation. Can you? Or would you try? Or what's your sort of response?
I think that hearing both sides would definitely help, and I think I could, if both sides were being heard instead of like my constant exposure to news side, negative side all of the time. I would like to hear both sides. So yes, I think if I was exposed to both, yes.
Right. So again, Mr. Chauvin doesn't have to call a witness, doesn't have to ask a question, doesn't have to prove anything. Can you abide by that? I mean, if hearing both sides is so tantamount to you, if you only continue to hear one side, would that make it more difficult?
I think what I mean by that is that Mr. Chauvin's side is his presumption of innocence. That's what I mean by that.
All right, a little more now about juror number 118, the most recent juror to be seated. She is a white woman, and we haven't heard from the court yet on her age, but we know that one of the pool reporters who was in the courtroom this morning estimates that her age is probably somewhere in her 20s. We know she works as a social worker. She told the attorneys that she wants to help people. She says she is neutral regarding the Black Lives Matter movement and also the Blue Lives Matter movement. Now let me bring in Court TV legal correspondent Chanley Painter, who is in downtown Minneapolis, to talk more about why the judge increased the number to 15. Chanley, good afternoon.
Hey, good afternoon, Julie. Yeah, so late Friday, he decided that he wanted to impanel 2 more jurors, one to reach the number of 14, which is what he wants for 12 jurors and 2 alternates, but also one more for 15, which he says because there will be this break between jury selection and the opening statements that begin next Monday, just in case something happens to a juror, he has that insurance, if you will, of one more so that he starts next Monday with the total of 14 without any issue. And again, there's only 14 because of social distancing inside this courtroom. The courtroom is completely redesigned for COVID-19 precautions. The jury is spread across one side of the courtroom, 6 feet apart. They have a little desk and a nice office cushioned chair to sit through where they can take notes and have a full view of everything going on in the courtroom.
Aw, that's nice to know they have cushioned chairs. I knew about the little desks. It kind of reminds me of a classroom. Didn't you? The way they were, apart from one another back in school. We don't want anyone looking at anyone else's paper. And here we want to make sure everyone is safe, right, with the 6 feet. I understand they're exactly measured 6 feet apart, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly right. You're so right. It's just like school. They can't copy off of each other or even see the paper or the notes of anyone sitting next to them. But it's a very unique setup, and it's completely measured out, not just on the jury side, which is they can only fit 14 there. That's why there's only 2 alternates. But on the attorney side also, that we can see from our Court TV cameras inside the courtroom, we have the attorney spread out with 2 different tables with plexiglass everywhere, and even the witness box and the plexiglass everywhere. And what's interesting about this courtroom, Julie, is that the defendant, Derek Chauvin, is actually sitting closest to the judge in the witness box. And for the jurors, well, they all can pretty much see him because they're just with the courtroom's design. There it is right there. That's what they look like. They got little desk chairs like at school, and they're nice cushioned swivel chairs for them to sit in, and a big screen, of course, where they can see all the evidence.
Right. So then when trial begins, I'm so glad you pointed that out, Shanley, because we know typically the state sits closest to the jury because the state carries the burden, and the burden never shifts. And here in this courtroom, because of COVID, because of where they're repositioned, it's hard to tell from what we're looking at because everything's empty. But did you say Derek Chauvin and the defense table will be closest to those little desks?
Yeah, closest to the witness box and the podium and the judge's bench. So if the jury's looking towards the attorneys, to their left will be the prosecutors, to the right will be the defense and the defendant himself. And they all have a pretty good view because the courtroom isn't that big. Like I said, it only fits those 14 jurors spread out. So they'll have all a clear view of everything that they need to see. And in the gallery, there's no gallery. So that's why they are spread out. No gallery in this courtroom. We'll have 1 seat designated for someone from the defense family, and then, of course, 1 from the family of George Floyd who can sit in there.
Yes, thank you for that. I want to talk to you, please, about the jury makeup so far, what we've been reporting, and then also Hennepin County and the demographics. I understand you have some information for us about how the jury pool typically is, and we can kind of compare it to who we have seated so far.
Yeah, sure. So, of course, our jury now, we just had number 14 seated, but we have 9 women, 5 men, and there are 6 people of color, 8 people who are white. But let's kind of take a view at the whole Hennepin County here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And for age, 65 plus, around 14.5% of the population in the county. And then for those under the age of 18, that makes it around 21.8% of Hennepin County here. And also, let's look at the race or the ethnic makeup of the county. For white, the majority, 74.2% white. And then we have black or African American, 13.8%. Hispanic, Latino, 7%, and Asian, 7.5%. So it's been quite impressive, Julie, to see the pool of prospective jurors coming in that really are even more diverse than the entire county population makeup throughout most of the pools that come in. Even when I've been in there, I've seen people of color from, African American, Hispanic, and Asian, of course, white as well. So it's been interesting that the jury, like we said, there's 6 people of color and 8 white, so even a little bit more than the percentages reflected in the county.
Right, definitely a diverse jury. Shanley, thank you so much for that. I'm being told we have to squeeze in a break right now, but when we come back, we're going to talk about who is on this prosecution team. It's a big team. Let me tell you, we've got 12 prosecutors compared to 1 defense attorney in this trial. We'll break it down for you when Court TV Live continues after this.
It's just so hard to know where the truth ends and then fiction begins.
New developments in the case of doomsday cult mom Lori Vallow and her husband Chad Daybell.
Authorities are still searching for Vallow's children.
How does she pose a threat to your children? I don't know what she's going to do with them.
Think about all the people that had to die and disappear.
Tell us where the kids are.
Nothing is coincidental.
This stretches just so beyond what anyone could imagine.
Investigators have recovered human remains at Chad Daybell's residence.
There's no way, Logan, I could ever come up with this.
This is no longer the search for missing children. This is the search for killers.
All eyes on this Idaho trial.
Lori was his follower. Chad Daybell's the prophet.
Chad had a vision, plagues, and foreign troops coming to the soil.
It's the doomsday couple, Chad and Lori Daybell on trial.
Thank you for watching Court TV Live, your front row seat to justice. I'm Julie Grant. The intense international interest in the Derek Chauvin murder trial, coupled with COVID-19 restrictions, has severely limited who can actually be inside the courtroom. So aside from the people who must be there, like Judge Peter Cahill, the presiding judge, the jurors, the alternate jurors, Derek Chauvin, of course, his defense lawyer, and the prosecutors, there are also 2 pool reporters, 1 family member from Derek Chauvin's family and 1 family member from George Floyd's family are permitted in there as well. And when we speak about Derek Chauvin's defense team, we're really talking about attorney Eric Nelson, you see him there at the podium, and his assistant. Those are the only 2 we see day in and day out. Every day, there are 4 attorneys, though, representing the state of Minnesota. They're all in the courtroom, and they are only a small part of a larger team of prosecutors who are on this case. Now, Judge Cahill commented on the disparity between the resources for the defense and the prosecution last week. Let's take a listen together to that now.
Let's recognize the fact that the state has a lot of lawyers on this case who can sit outside this courtroom and start grinding out things. Mr. Nelson does not have the same level of support. How many lawyers now are admitted pro hoc vice and are working for the state on this case so far, Mr. Slisher? Is it 10, 12?
I don't have that number, Your Honor, but I do know that the Police Federation, the union, is funding the defendant's defense, and they have...
Let's not talk about that. We're not talking about how things are funded. I'm just saying, I can understand why what I'm saying is, I can understand why the state is able to produce affidavits and memos so quickly, because there are a lot of lawyers working outside this courtroom. I can't expect that Mr. Nelson would walk in this afternoon with affidavits when we've been in jury selection all day. And I think what we're getting into is criticizing each other's performance. Let's not do that.
All right, we all heard the judge loud and clear there. Excellent judge on this case, by the way, who has been a prosecutor and a criminal defense attorney. He knows his stuff. Now let's get to know these prosecutors, shall we? Let me bring back in Court TV legal correspondent Shanley Painter to talk about this very large team of both government and private attorneys. Shanley.
Yeah, very large team. Let's start with those who are being paid by the state of Minnesota. We have several here with the Attorney General's team brought up. We, of course, have the Attorney General of Minnesota, Keith Ellison, and we see him in the courtroom quite a lot. Matthew Frank is the Assistant Attorney General, and he's been signing a lot of these court filings and documents over the last several months and really arguing many of the motions in this case. And then we see Aaron Eldridge and Joshua Larson, filling those 2 seats, extra seats in and out of the courtroom. It's almost like they rotate in and out, Julie, throughout this jury selection process or where the motions are being argued. And then we have some just on the team from our, private attorneys and presenting attorneys that make up the prosecution team. And the attorneys from Minnesota, we are very familiar, of course, with Stephen Schlischer, who's been doing a lot of the voir dire and back and forth, Jerry Blackwell and Lola Aguilu, I don't know if I pronounce her name right, is also from Minnesota. But the out-of-state attorneys, we have Christina Marinakis, and she's mostly, even though she has a JD, she's mostly being here for the jury consultant, if you will. That's who Slisher will consult with before they pass for cause or exercise a strike inside the courtroom. And then we have those that have appeared via Zoom arguing motions. We have Neil Katyal, Sundeep Iyer, again appearing pro hoc vice, and then Nathaniel Zielinski. He was the newest one. Actually entered into the, court pro hoc vice last week. And then we have Harrison Kilgore, Victoria Joseph, and Danielle Stemple. So several